Welcome, everyone. I'm Danny Torres, host of the Talkin 21 podcast and part of the Our Esquina podcast network. Episode 5 for season 2 will forever hold a special place in my heart because not only will this be our first bilingual podcast, but our listeners will be hearing directly from a member of the Clemente family. Roberto Clemente Walker impacted millions of baseball fans around the world. But within his immediate family, in Puerto Rico, his niece, Jannette Clemente Santana, will share some amazing stories about her favorite uncle, who is affectionately called Momen throughout his childhood. Jannette's father, Don Justino Clemente Walker, who is 93 years old, a decorated Korean War veteran, un borinquenier, and the oldest brother of Roberto. He still remembers his beloved sibling as an unbelievably talented athlete, but also a kind, generous brother who is admired and respected. But before he became the great one, Momen had this unbelievable desire to always help the less fortunate. And that determination would follow him throughout his entire life until his untimely passing on New Year's Eve in 1972. Jannette, like her famous uncle, can literally brighten a room with her radiant smile, shared some touching stories about her uncle Momen and how he impacted her life. Along with her sister Judith, they've continued that extraordinary legacy in Puerto Rico in their own unique way. And now, here is my conversation with my dear friend, mi querida amiga, the niece of Roberto Clemente Walker, Jannette Clemente Santana, who is participating in her very first podcast and speaking entirely in English. Well, Jannette Clemente, thank you very much for being with us on the Talkin 21 podcast. You're our first guest directly from Puerto Rico. How are you doing this evening, Jannette?
Fine, very fine. Thank you, Danny.
For our Talkin 21 listeners, I'd like if you can share with us a bit about your childhood and your precious family in Puerto Rico.
As you know, my name is Jannette Clemente Santana, and I am the oldest daughter of Justino Clemente Walker and Carmen Santana Mojica. My father is Roberto's oldest brother. My sister Judith and I are very close. We are like twins. Our parents taught us to respect everyone. My grandparents, uncles, and cousins play a big part in our lives.
As the nieces of Roberto Clemente Walker, Judith and Jannette were in complete awe of their famous uncle, Tio Momen. Always impeccably dressed, Tio Momen was charming, handsome, and at an early age seemed to always be preoccupied with many things, hence the nickname Momen, and we will hear how that came to be momentarily. Tio Momen's compassion for humanity would follow him throughout his phenomenal career, and Jannette's youngest sister, Judith, has dedicated her entire life through the preservation of artifacts, family heirlooms, and rare photos of her beloved uncle as a ball player, brother, husband, and father. And in July 1994, at the recommendation of their father, Don Justino Clemente, they traveled to Pittsburgh to witness the unveiling of a bronze statue outside the ballpark dedicated to their uncle, who not only was one of the greatest athletes in the game, but certainly the greatest humanitarian to play in the big leagues. It's a heartfelt, filled with stories as the one shared by the niece of Tio Momen that will make for an enjoyable book she hopes to one day write.
From a young age, I listened to my father share a story about my Uncle Momen. That was Uncle Roberto nickname. I will talk more about that. In July 1994, I went to see the new statue in honor of my uncle, and my father told us to go to Pittsburgh to represent him. My sister Judith always collect items of our uncle, and like her, I had made an effort to keep my uncle's memory alive, not only in baseball, but also as human then.
Well, I'm telling you, just listening to you right now, Janet, I can't wait to hear some more stories about Uncle Momen. And we're going to be telling our listeners how he got that nickname. So, Janet, here it is that we met in Pittsburgh in 2006. And I always enjoyed that relationship you have with your parents. But before we talk about your father, can you please share some stories with our listeners about your beautiful mother?
Oh, thank you, Danny, for this question. In 2006 trip was my second visit to Pittsburgh. The celebration in 1994 motivates my sister and I to go back to Pittsburgh.
I remember, Janet, that was also the All-Star game at PNC Park in Pittsburgh, and Doña Vera, que descanse en paz, may she rest in peace, she received an award.
That's right, Danny. You have a good memory. So we'd go to the airport, and Susan Warner, the sculptor of the Clemente statue at the PNC Park in Pittsburgh, to pick us up. We went with our cousin Sulma, who lives in Texas. This trip was very special. Many people ask about my father, but my mother always played a big role in our lives. She is the person who gives us strength. She helped in school and religious education. As children, she bought us beautiful dresses, shoes, and bows for our hair. She was secretary at the hardware store in Carolina. We call my Uncle Momen, but Mommy always called her brother-in-law by his first name, Roberto. From her stories, I see she was my Uncle Roberto favorite sister-in-law. No se lo digan a nadie, pero eso fue así.
That's our secret. That's our secret.
I have many stories about many uncles with the purpose of writing a book. I think it's necessary for the world to know the origins of Roberto Clemente Walker, born in humble town called San Antonio.
The beloved son of San Antonio was certainly a humble man, and this distinguished trait would follow him throughout his journey from Puerto Rico to the United States. And when he truly became the great one, his fans embraced Clemente like no other pirate superstar, simply because he always took a moment to sign an autograph, answer countless fan mail, visit children in the hospital, and perform on the highest level when on the field. But before he became a legendary ball player, Clemente truly showed his appreciation and respect for his oldest brother. Many years ago, Jannette's father recounted a touching story to his oldest daughter that our listeners will be hearing for the very first time on this podcast. It happened when both brothers were competing in a track meet in Puerto Rico. This particular incident speaks volumes on who Roberto Clemente was as a competitor, but also the admiration he had for his oldest brother. So, Janet, please, if you can, talk a bit now more about your father, who is still with us. God bless your father, Don Martino, his love of baseball, and what was his occupation?
Oh, from a very young age, my father loved sport. He also ran track. He competed in 100, 200 meter races. He also played softball and was a pitcher, but his favorite sport was baseball. My father had great skill, like me, Uncle Roberto. My father was an inspiration for his brother. And when Uncle Momen was in the major league, my father would help me help him. My grandfather made sure will send me father to Pittsburgh when something was wrong. When my father went to the U.S. Army, his year of service didn't allow him to continue as a professional ball player. And for many years, he worked at the glass company in Cataño, Puerto Rico, the Puerto Rico Glass.
Yes, I am very familiar. I have heard of this particular company there in Cataño, Puerto Rico. So, Janet, I'm listening to you, and immediately this came to my mind. Here it is. When was the first time por primera vez, that you heard your uncle was a famous ball player?
Danny, from a very young age, I listened to my father, family, and friends talk about his game. I love to listen, but I must say, I never imagined how big he was in baseball. A former classmate of Uncle Momen from his school sent me a picture of my uncle that he gave him as a child. I was shocked. I wish I had the beautiful photo with me today.
Oh, there's some way that we have to see this picture. So I hope that maybe one day that could be the case. Janet, I remember this conversation with you. I was in my bedroom and you and I were talking about your next appearance. Well, the next appearance to be on my podcast on Talkin 21. And immediately I said to myself, I need to hear some more stories. And you told me a rather interesting story between your father, Don Martino, and Uncle Momen, Uncle Roberto. And here it is. It was a competition, I believe something along the lines of track and field, and your father won a prize. What your father did for Uncle Momen was unbelievable. It was special. Can you share with our listeners that particular story?
Yes, when my father came back to Puerto Rico from the Korean War, we celebrate Patron Feast Day, and in Spanish called the Fiestas Patronales, honoring a saint in each town in Puerto Rico. Esas fiestas son especiales y muy alegres.
Yeah.
This happens every year on the island. There were different sports competitions and at the festivals. My dad played baseball and my uncle went to see him. My father also was in the high jump competition. My uncle is 7 years younger and asked if he can participate as well. And in the end, only my father and my uncle remain.
Wow.
My Uncle Momen didn't want to compete with his older brother and he decided to stop.
Wow.
Él era especial.
Wow.
But my father received the first prize by jumping 6 feet high. He won a beautiful guayabera. Uncle loved the guayabera because he always liked to dress up. My father asked to also give his brother a guayabera that he would pay for it. My father said in a few weeks, Roberto jumped more than 6 feet. My father did not want to embarrass his famous brother in front of the fans in Puerto Rico.
I'm starting to hear this relationship with your father, Don Martino, and Uncle Momen. It truly was a special, special relationship. I just wish I had a guayabera right now. I wish I had one. Janet, what memories do you have of Uncle Momen, Uncle Roberto, playing the game that he loved so much, the game of baseball?
I only remember my father in front of the television or listen to the games of the radio in the English language. I did not understand, but I can remember September 30, 1972. All of Puerto Rico was waiting for 3,000 heads. My sister and I, with our father, were so happy. Mi mamá estaba trabajando, no estaba en la casa, solamente nosotros tres.
Okay, so
Now,
your mother was working, and it was just the three of you.
see, now I understand what happened, and when I watch the video or hear the game, I get very emotional.
Hace el wind-up, ahí va el lanzamiento, la tira y ahí va la línea tremenda. Entra Messi César, la bola pica, va a dar contra la pared. El hit número 3000, lo logró, lo logró. Un doble de Roberto Clemente contra la pared de los César, como él lo quería, limpio completamente.
And let me tell you, I get emotional seeing it because I remember the great, que descanse en paz, may he rest in peace, Felo Ramirez calling the 3,000th hit. You know,
es
Janet,
así, él le dio, para los latinos le dio vida esa narración que fue para la historia.
absolutely. That narration brought the island to its feet. In the United States, it was Bob Prince that called it. And you might have heard that name. Remember Bob Prince, who was also the play-by-play at PNC, at PNC at Three Rivers Stadium. So here it is, Janet. For baseball fans in the United States, donde yo vivo, I live in New York City. And a lot of people do not know this because you've been saying it throughout the podcast. And my question is, how did the nickname Momen become a reality? How did he get that nickname?
Okay, my uncle was always busy doing something. My grandmother Luisa, her nieces, take care of her children. Her niece Flora give Roberto that nickname. She will say, Roberto ven, Roberto ven. And he will say, I in a moment. And that's why she gave him the nickname Momen.
Now, interesting, Janet, that you said Roberto ven. And for our English listeners, Roberto ven is very simply, Roberto, come, and Roberto would simply say, in a moment, in a moment.
In a moment,
Yeah.
in a moment.
So that is the origins of Momen. And that's a great story.
Yes.
That's a great story. You know, Janet, you have shared so many stories, and I know there's so much to share for our listeners. But something that even I wanted to know, because I know my grandparents were very special. Everybody loves their abuelos. Tell me about your grandparents and how proud they were of Uncle Momen.
Okay, my grandmother Luisa was very special with all her grandchildren. I can remember her house was always full of friends and fans. I always hear it was a joyful home. I thank God she stayed with us in my parents' home before she passed away. My grandfather Melchor was very serious and quiet. He didn't speak much, but he's short with words. And I remember he always kept in his room some tasty cookies for us. My grandparents were very proud of Uncle Momen. Their youngest son was their pride. They enjoy his career in the baseball. They always told him, you are not better than anyone and nobody is better than you.
Very humble indeed, Janet, because I think once again, I know that is what they loved about your uncle. Los fanáticos aquí, the fans in the United States, loved that about Roberto Clemente Walker, that he was a humble person, always giving to the less fortunate, giving to children. You know, Janet, I have a special surprise for you. And that surprise is one of our listeners who is direct from Puerto Rico, from Carolina, Puerto Rico.
Woo!
Yes. Y él se llama Alexis Merced. And Alexis Merced listens to Talkin 21 directly from Puerto Rico, and he has a question. And the question is, Janet, everyone knows Clemente, the baseball player, the bigger than life figure, especially for this person, Alexis Merced from Carolina, Puerto Rico. That is how he has always looked at your uncle, bigger than life. I want you, if you can share for Alexis, share about Uncle Momen, Uncle Roberto, what he was when the cameras, the lights were off. What was Uncle Momen, Uncle Roberto to Janet and Judith Clemente?
Ok, cuando mi tío Roberto llegaba a mi hogar era una gran fiesta. Siempre quiso saber cuál deporte era el preferido, el de Judith y el mío, pero nosotras lo que nos gusta es bailar. Era extraordinario, sencillo, humilde, y eso lo demostraba también en la calle, cuando la gente en el pueblo no lo llamaban por ese Roberto Clemente, sino lo llamaban por Momen, que era su nombre, el nombre que Flora le puso a él, el nickname, como le llaman en el inglés. Y la gente lo llamaba y él compartía con la gente en la calle. Fue un gran ejemplo para todos, incluyendo a sus hermanos, que todos eran mayores que él, porque era una persona de mucha estructura y hay personas que nacen con ese ángel de ser líder, y él lo fue desde su juventud. Mi tío también, Roberto, era adorable. Siempre estaba presente, siempre va a estar presente en mi memoria. Y mi compromiso con el mundo, al igual que de mi familia, es mantener vivo su legado. Y agradecemos a todas las personas, como el caballero que nos hace la pregunta en esta noche, al igual a cada uno de ustedes que están trabajando para esta producción, el que ustedes mantengan su legado vivo a través de lo que saben ustedes hacer, que es comunicarle al público.
And for our English listeners, here is Janette's response to a question from a Talking 21 listener, Alexis Merced, from Carolina, Puerto Rico. When Uncle Roberto arrived at my home, it was a huge celebration. He always wanted to know what was the preferred sport for Judith and I, but for us, we loved to dance. He was extraordinary, sincere, humble, and he demonstrated this in the streets. People in the neighborhood didn't call him Roberto Clemente, but by his nickname, Momen, the name given to him. They would call him, and he interacted with them in the streets. He was a great example to all, especially to his brothers who were older than him. He was a very structured person, and there are people born to be leaders, and he was that from his childhood. My Uncle Roberto was always adorable. He will always be present in my memories, and my commitment to the world, and likewise to my family, is to continue his legacy and keep it alive. We are very appreciative, especially to the gentleman who asked this question and everyone involved in this podcast, to keep his legacy alive, and I wish to communicate this to the public. Y gracias por esa palabra, porque yo sé también en los años que yo tengo la mitad de con ustedes, que yo sé, yo soy parte de la familia Clemente y agradezco muchos años ya, y tú sabes, Janet y Judith, su papá, tu mamá, lo quiero muchísimo. Y
gracias,
vamos a cambiar ahora el tema, hablar ahora mismo en inglés, porque tú estás hablando inglés. For the first time on a podcast, Janet, you were doing phenomenal. You were doing phenomenal. Yes. So can we clap? Can we clap?
I'm happy.
Yes.
I'm happy.
You should be happy. You should be happy. So Janet, you know, something that I really thought carefully this last question, because I know for a fact when I spoke, may ella descanse en paz, with Mrs. Clemente, I only asked about her husband 2 times, 2 veces, hablar de su esposo. In the 18 years, en los 18 años, I never, nunca hablaba de el esposo de ella. 2 times, 2 veces solamente. So, entonces ahora yo no quiero hablar de su muerte. Yo quiero hablar de su legado. I want to talk about his legacy. So, Jannette Clemente, you know his legacy is global, and you must be very proud, and he's still alive. So, Jannette, his legacy in your eyes, how would you describe it?
Danny, my uncle was a special human being. His legacy is known around the world. Over the years, he has become a national symbol in Puerto Rico and in the United States. He is the baseball of fame in Cooperstown. The fans, writers, baseball players, and even of social media keep my uncle memory alive. The love from all the people when he played for the pirates, and for his humanitarian work makes the Clemente family feel very proud.
Oh God, we have gathered here to commemorate Roberto el Magnifico, one of your children who was so very much alive while he was with us. We remember his vitality, his grace, his agility, his exuberance on the playing field, where he was so thrilling to watch. You chose to bring to a close his life as he attempted to help others to live. We ask that his memory will continue to enliven us in showing proper respect for the precious gift of life in ourselves and our fellow man, wherever he be.
I'm going to tell you something. My father is 93, and when he talks about his brother, he only say he is missing and not that. And I believe my uncle still lives in all of us.
Thank you, Jannette, for joining us, and we're looking forward to inviting you back on the Talkin 21 podcast. We had a lot of fun, and you did a wonderful job recording an interview in English for the very first time. And considering your father, Don Justino, only spoke in Spanish, we decided to have him on a future podcast to talk about his service in the Korean War, an interesting tale about a Baseball Hall of Famer and Korean War veteran Ted Williams, and what did Willie Mays actually say to your uncle, Tio Momen, while he was in the dugout after the 3,000th hit, and of course, his brother Momen, who, as Jannette Clemente Santana stated in the podcast, how he remembers the great one. He will only say he is missing and not dead. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and on Instagram at Talkin 21 Podcast. And yes, we're also on Facebook and on YouTube. A special thank you to our co-writer, executive producer, Ras Guevara, and to our social media manager, Senor Bezo. This is your host, Danny Torres, and be sure to follow me on Twitter at DannyT21. Keep tuning in for our continued conversation about the great one, Roberto Clemente Walker. Adios.